So my name is Peter Young. I'm a member of the Committee 100, and I also happen to be chair of this series, the initiative, Asian American Career Ceilings Initiative. Uh, it has been a wonderful experience because I think what we've done over the year is to really help people understand the issue better, or to participate, or hear from experts, or hear from people who've gone through different experiences. If you could believe it, this is actually the 10th webcast in this program. Initially, we were going to have two webcasts and then a conference on April 4th, which obviously was postponed, although we hope to be able to reschedule it on a date that's comfortable for people. But we decided, well, why not continue webcasts and have different topics and different types of speakers. So we had millennials, we had experts who are running nonprofits, we have two highly regarded authors, we had people who have followed the data, we have someone from government, from nonprofit stuff. So we tried to really create a series that really, in each case, is different and brings a different perspective to this issue. We recognize that there are many, many organizations and people who have been focused on this problem for quite a long time. So we feel that our role is to really just to contribute to the efforts of all these other people and act as a convener where that is very, very useful. I just want to say that after my welcoming comment, which will be just for a few minutes, we're going to have a fireside chat for about 35, 40 minutes. And I will pose questions of our two panelists. And then we want to leave at least 10 or 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. And the way this works is you can ask your question basically by using the chat function that's at the bottom of your screen. Just type in the question. I'll read them to our panelists, and they'll answer the questions that we can get to in the time frame. We are doing something slightly different this time. We decided that we want to create an opportunity for all of you to meet each other and perhaps also meet the speakers. So what we've done is we've set up a separate link, which was emailed to all of you. It's the second link where at 9 o'clock, when we're finished with this webcast, we will then move to the second link, Zoom session. And you can click on that from the email that you received. And we're going to break people into breakout rooms and really just give you an opportunity to chat with each other. And one or two of the speakers, I think, will probably try to join as well. So, so with that, I am just very pleased to have the two panelists today. We thought it'd be very interesting to have a partner at McKinsey, Harrison Long, who is heavily, heavily involved with the diversity programs and studies, et cetera, that are that McKinsey does, but also obviously McKinsey, because they serve many, many corporations around the world, they have their own perspective because they're involved with helping them solve problems. So they have their own perspective on what companies are doing. I'm also equally pleased to have David Lee, who is also a friend, and he is the CEO of, he changed their name this year to CMC Materials, public company, and really one of the leading companies supplying pads and slurries for the semiconductor industry, without which none of these devices, including the laptop that I'm using now, would be able to function. And he's had an exceptional career and has an interesting situation in that it's a public US company that's fairly substantial in size, and yet he divides his time between Singapore and Chicago. I won't ask him which one has better weather, but it is a good example of the international aspects of business today. So with that, let me start off. I've given you a little background about the two panelists, but I do hope that we can accomplish two things. One is that we can learn from our two speakers about things they know from their positions, their respective positions, about practices generally, both in companies at the leadership level, but also the board, but also to share some of the lessons and observations from their own personal experiences, because each of them has, in a different way, had personal experiences or observations that could be very, very valuable to all of you. So with that, let me start arbitrarily with Harrison. Harrison, we've chatted about this before, but could you describe some of the work that McKinsey has done and the articles that they published? I know you were a co-author of some on this issue of the Asian American challenge with regard to climbing the corporate ladder.
Thank you, Peter. First of all, thank you for inviting myself to come and speak into this webinar. I greatly appreciate the opportunity of using this platform. And to answer your question, beyond sort of my role as a consultant in our technology and digital practices, I'm also one of our leaders in our diversity and inclusion affinity group called Asians at McKinsey, which is an internal employee resources group that focuses on the advancement of the Asian American community. It is sort of within my leadership within this group where we're starting our external orientation in liaising with different organizations, such as the Committee of 100, as well as using the McKinsey platform to publish articles, research, et cetera, that sort of highlights and creates awareness of some of the issues that we're seeing today. Last year, we published an article within Fortune that shows the lack of Asian American leadership in the Fortune 500, as well as board representation. More recently, we focused a particular research on the impact of COVID-19 to the Asian American community, particularly anchored on the area where there are many Asian Americans who are in the frontline jobs, whether it be in the medical professional fields, as well as in the food and hospitality services industry. Moreover, there was also a big idea and notion on highlighting the challenges of Asian American businesses. So net, our focus area is not just on sort of advancing the Asian American cohort within McKinsey, but also broader within our clients and seeing what they see in the management team, as well as the broader society as well.
Yeah, and I know, Harrison, you were a panelist in February, and I think one of the comments you made, which was very important, is that your observation is that the problem is not people getting into good colleges or getting jobs at companies. The problem really starts when they get to the middle ranks, and that's where things start to fall apart. And so we'll touch on that as well, because it's kind of interesting, right? Because a lot of people perceive, well, how come, what's the problem? And in part because they see the number of Asian Americans who get into good schools and get into jobs, but they don't see the other half. David, let me start out by just asking you, you've had really a kind of an extraordinary career. Could you maybe walk through your own career and maybe point to some of the critical factors that led to your advancement, and particularly where you feel that the issue of Asian American, your Chinese American, Asian American background was somehow, involved in as a factor?
Sure, thanks, Peter. And it's an honor to be here, as Harrison mentioned. Also nice to meet Harrison. I have many great friends at McKinsey. And thanks again for the opportunity to participate. For ours, and by the way, I have to give Peter credit. I tried to trip up Peter by having our company name change a couple weeks ago, but he still caught on to it. So yes, we have changed from Cabot Microelectronics to CMC Materials. And as Peter mentioned, we're a critical supplier of specialty materials to the semiconductor and oil and gas industries, and have known Peter for many years. So I thought I could trip him up, but I couldn't get him. But again, an honor to be here. I'll share a little bit about my career and perhaps highlight a few things that might be helpful for the audience. For me, I have never had a straight line career path. I started out with a background in chemical engineering, but I've always been more interested, especially earlier in my career, and I've been with my current company for over 20 years. I've always been more focused on finding that next opportunity to learn rather than having kind of a straight path to the CEO position or an executive position. And I think that's served me well because, there is no straight path to any type of career. And many of us end up where we are through hard work and contribution, but also because of the different opportunities and learnings that we've had a chance to do. So for example, for me, early in my career, I started in engineering. I wanted to get in on the commercial side, so took a role in procurement, which was a bit non-traditional, learned a lot there, got my MBA, and then moved on to another role, which was investor relations before running some of our businesses. And then about 15 years ago, moved out to Asia, first spending about 10 years in Shanghai, and then most recently moving to Singapore. Peter, as you mentioned, I still split my time between Asia and the US, although obviously with the pandemic, a lot more time in Singapore, which my family is delighted with, that I'm not traveling as much. But, if I look back on my career, a few things I'd highlight. One is that I mentioned not having this straight line career path, being open to different opportunities. I think that's also served me well later in my career, continuing to be a lifelong learner. That's something I got from my parents, who are in their 80s and still working hard on clean water technology. And so being a lifelong learner, I've taken a few courses during the pandemic, even just to continue to sharpen my skills. And so I think those practices have benefited me throughout my career. Moving to Asia, obviously, for our business, Asia is an important part of our company's business ongoing. And so having that background, having that cultural, both the cultural and the multilingual capability, I think that's also served me well. And I think the last piece I guess I would mention is, I think I recognized early on that I'm kind of an introvert, but finding time to network, at least at my level, or if not a bit above my level, has served me well as well. So a few things I'd highlight coming into the discussion.
And David, a follow-on question. So you mentioned that you're an introvert. I don't entirely buy that argument, but I can sort of half buy that argument. But that's actually partly an Asian American issue, right? Which is we tend not to speak up and so forth. And whether you call it introversion or being reticent, I think that is a factor, right? But and how did you overcome that? Because obviously, I think that's probably generically true for Asian Americans, right?
Yeah, I think it's really something, if I look back on, first, I would say now more than ever, I think it's a really important time for us as Asian American leaders to embrace our heritage. And in doing so, there's certain strengths that are there that perhaps being multilingual, multicultural, and all the other strengths that brings, but also having the self-awareness of maybe there's some things that I need to do to be more self-aware of what could be my biases. For example, you brought up a great one. Growing up in a typical Chinese American household, I have a tendency more towards harmony and perhaps not be as outspoken, especially earlier in my career. And so being kind of aware of all those different cultural nuances, I think is really important, because when you get into a multinational company, you've got to mix it up with people from all different cultures, and you've got to you got to work on your executive presence, for example. Being self-aware of those things about yourself I think is really important. And again, something I've become more and more attuned to over the years.
A second question for you, David, and then we'll move to broader questions. All companies are focusing, and either reluctantly or enthusiastically, on this issue, generally about diversification, et cetera. For your company, what are some of the policies and practices at your company that to try to address this issue of, of career ceilings, not only for Asian Americans, but generally, because it is a problem in many, many companies, right?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I think, again, especially today with all of the momentum movements like Black Lives Matter has gotten, and it's an important time right now in the U.S. to have that. And I know that Harrison and the team at McKinsey are doing some really important work to help companies there. I think for our company, as with any company, diversity, inclusion, and we also add belonging. So diversity, inclusion, belonging, it's a journey. And we've tried many different things. We've been successful at some and not as successful at others, but it's certainly something that from myself to our board, to our management team, we're extremely committed to. I think that's really a key piece of it, which is how committed are you as a top management and board to making progress in this area? I'm fortunate to be with a company that's been celebrated for diversity, both on our board and our management team. That's gender diversity mostly. But I think, there's things we keep trying different things. I think, so, just to kind of highlight a few, I think one is having that top management commitment, really, really important. I think being kind of willing to try new things and not be successful is another. I started many years ago an initiative of trying to move Asian leaders throughout the organization. It didn't really work, especially through the pandemic. You're not able to move people around as much, but trying different things, I think, is really important. And I think the last thing, and I know perhaps Harrison has many more things to add, but I think it is, you focus on what you measure. And so having the right statistics or the right metrics that are right for your organization, I think are really important. Otherwise, it just becomes sort of this qualitative thing that you want to make progress in, but aren't moving the ball. I think you need to have some metrics there, and we've refined our metrics over the years there as well. But it's a journey. We're not where we need to be, but I think we've made some really good progress, especially on the area of gender in our company.
Yeah, and in fact, you make an important point about the leaders having to believe in this, because you could put as many policies as you want underneath and have directors of diversity, whatever. But if people don't feel there's a commitment by the leadership at senior management, it's not going to work, because they have to set an example and they have to set the tone.
And by the way, maybe Peter, David, just a few more points to add to that one, right? I think the leadership ultimately is the most important, because they are the individuals who drive the organization and who lead by example, right? But that being said, I've seen some organization basically, ask the CHRO or the Chief Human Resource Officer or the head of diversity to say, hey, this is your program, your initiative, go deal with it. That's not necessarily the right answer, because it is each and all respective members of the management team or the leadership team that has a hand to play in this, right? The CHRO and the head of diversity may facilitate and can come up with ideas, but the ownership needs to be broad across the entire management team.
Yeah.
The metrics point is also very important, because not only are we talking about it, we're going to hold each other accountable to it, and to show that we're measured against it with some measurable outcome. I know some organizations actually tie it to compensation, performance evaluation, a lot of the other dimensions that can come into play as well.
Yeah. Well, go ahead, David.
On Harrison's point, I think the other thing I'd mention that is probably just individual for each company, but I'll tell you, one of the things in my career that really was important to me, perhaps for a non-traditional reason, is having a vibrant organization makes it a lot easier to to promote change throughout the company. So one of the reasons why we focus on growth, and we've done some work with Peter as well, to look at how to grow our company even faster. But one of the motivations for me to do so, of course, I think it results in shareholder value. But I think really for me, having the experience of 20 years in a company and first starting in a really vibrant, fast-growing company and having those different opportunities to move around was really important to me. And that's part of the legacy I want to leave for our organization as well. So that's one of the key reasons why we focus on growth in our company, is so that we can have a vibrant organization where people do get those opportunities. You can have the great programs, the great metrics, but the reality is if you don't have mobility within the organization, very difficult to bring in new leaders, promote from within. And so that whole system needs to be working in rhythm together.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to move to a question that's actually for both of you, all right? And that is, one of the issues people say, well, how big a problem is it, right? And I think I've seen a lot of data that says that it really is a significant problem, very meaningful problem for Asian Americans, both at the board level, but also senior management levels. But what I like to do, and I think people realize it, but what do each of you think are the primary causes of this problem, when you get to a certain place in the ladder? And I'll let either one of you, start.
Yeah, I'll defer to Harrison first.
Okay. No, happy to do so. To be honest with you, Peter, I don't think there is, one silver bullet in terms of the major cause and driver to highlight or to illustrate this, challenge or problem. I think of our research and our interviews and everything that I've seen, there's probably 4 or 5 areas that sort of alludes to this. One is, as you get higher and higher up in the management ranks, the people relationships become more important, right? And the question is how good or not so good, Asian Americans can form these relationships with the upper executive ranks, which in many cases often look for people that are similar like them in order to sponsor and mentor them for the next generation. That I think is one. Number 2 is there's probably a little bit of a cultural aspect to it as well, right? I think in the Asian American culture, a lot of it is really about deferring to, your seniors and to executives. And I think, David, you shared a story about, growing up in a Chinese American household, right? There are certain points in your career where it's actually critically important to speak up and to step up, whether it's for a particular stretch assignment, whether it's to say, hey, my performance evaluation should not be this, and it should be this based on the following reasons, and really push the bound of what I call the norm culturally, right? And I think the third reason is, again, a little bit more on the cultural aspect is Asian Americans in general are taught to have and want a comfortable life, right? In many cases, that's making, a nice, comfortable 6-figure salary. They're not taught to say, hey, you should dream and shoot for the moon and become a CEO, or start your own business and become a multimillionaire or billionaire, right? So there's a notion on safety and risk aversion there. And I think to really get to the tops, and you can see by the varied path that David has taken, and even in his personal career, has taken a lot of risk and, culminating the point and the role that he has now, right? So I think I just want to highlight a few reasons. And again, I don't think there's one particular reason that's the sole driver, but I think all these actually contribute to that.
David, your
I
comment?
agree with Harrison. I agree with Harrison. First, let's just acknowledge it is an issue, right? The data is pretty definitive about what's the representation like of Asian Americans when you get to the executive suite, not even counting the CEO role. And so there is an underrepresentation there. And I totally agree with the 3 points that Harrison made. First, what is the cohort? Who is responsible for promoting and advocating for the leader to continue moving on in their career? And I would say first for myself, I'm blessed and fortunate to have worked for great bosses and managers that believed in me and gave me opportunities. If you don't have that, it really actually doesn't matter sometimes how hard you're trying. if you don't have that manager or that boss that's committed to your success, you're not going to make it very far. And so one of my pieces of advice, if you're in that situation, you really should think carefully about what are your long-term career ambitions, and would you be better working for someone that is really invested in your success? And I think that becomes a critical factor on an individual basis, but it also, because of where we are today, most boards are still white males. And I know there's a lot of change efforts along the way, but that's kind of the systemic issue right now. And until we make more progress in that area, you're not going to see breakthroughs. And so actually, if I'm being candid, it's one of the reasons why I was so excited to be part of this webinar, because I think part of it is opening up that conversation and talking about it and recognizing that there is an issue there. And there are things that we can do practically. Harrison mentioned a few, and there are others that are it's going to take some time as well. But having that conversation openly, I think, is really important.
Yeah, and in fact, I'd like to add to reinforce what David said, is you need to have people help you. But it's a catch-22, because it's natural for human beings to help people that they feel similar to them. So the problem is, if everyone above is not Asian, you don't have someone who's, there's a kind of a trap. The other side of it is, all of you who are all listening to this broadcast, no matter what level you are, try to help other people, either who are junior to you or friends, whatever. Try to help them in their careers, because if you don't, we don't get that extra energy trying to help either mentor or give good advice to people. One other question I have for both of you, and actually you're well qualified to answer this question because you're in international businesses and you're in firms that serve many different industries. Do you think that there is a difference in terms of this problem by industry? Do you think that technology or healthcare or industrial manufacturing, do you think there's a difference in terms of how big or how the nature of the problem?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first, David. I think from what we have seen across different companies and industries, there is a difference. The question is, how bad is the problem, right? And what I mean by that is, if you look at the upper echelon of many management team, there isn't a lot of Asian Americans or Chinese Americans, regardless of the industry, whether it's technology, banking, so on and so forth, right? Now, as you go down the ranks, I think there are certain industries that actually have a lot of Asian Americans, right? If you look at, one of your Committee of 100 colleagues, Buck G's report, particularly in the technology industry, especially at the entry levels, the fresh graduates level, et cetera, there's quite a number of technology companies that employ Asian Americans, right? Similarly to, if you look at many professional services firms, accounting firms like the Big Four, many of the consulting firms, banks, investment banks, a lot of these professional services firms actually do well in terms of attracting the junior folks, fresh into the company. The challenge is, once they hit a certain level, right? Once they hit manager or director in the industry, or once they hit in the consulting world, a project leader or an engagement manager or a VP in a bank, that is where we see a tremendous drop-off that actually exists. And therefore, alluding to back to the original number, which is what I gave, if you look at the senior management ranks, which is at the end of the day, the decision maker in any organization, we're typically at the low single digits across the board.
David, any comments about industry?
Yeah, my perspective obviously is much more grounded in the tech side. And I agree with Harrison that obviously there's no shortage of great candidates at the engineering level, technical level. So you tend to see great representation there. But as people matriculate through the organization, you start to see fewer and fewer. Now, my organization's a little different because we have such a significant base of business in Asia. So I'm not just thinking about Asian Americans, but also Asian leaders. So we operate in, 6 different companies in Asia, countries in Asia, and we have about 40% of our organization is Asian. So we tend to have a pretty significant pool. But I will say, to Harrison's point, at a certain level, perhaps, at the managing director level for our company, you start to see fewer and fewer representatives. And I think it's also, there's a crossroads of also both the encouragement and mentoring and focus from the organization, and then the personal aspiration and ambition. Both of those have to be aligned well. For me, certainly it worked out well, but for others, I think that it's not easy, and I think that's why the issue is still there. It's a pretty nuanced issue as well, but again, one that we should be talking about, and one that I think progress can be made in over time.
I'm going to make a somewhat unusual comment, and that is, although this is a panel about climbing the corporate ladder, I want to make one observation, which is a number of ethnic groups, Chinese Americans and Asian Americans and Jewish Americans and so forth, actually, in many cases, took the route of starting their own companies, right? Mm-hmm. And I would say that doesn't necessarily mean it's defeat, but it's another way of succeeding. And, a great example is a very famous committee, a 100-member, Morris Chang, who rose through Intel, brilliant guy, right? But didn't get the CEO position, and went off and started Taiwan Semiconductor, which is one of the most successful, semiconductor companies in the world. David knows the company well because you do business with them, right? But there's an example. So it doesn't mean that's the only solution, but it is one solution that has been true for many ethnic groups, which is, form your own company and so forth. And of course, we all know that Asian Americans are genetically capitalist, something my father once said. So that's another route to consider if you feel that that's the best fit for you, right? There's a huge amount of publicity right now about, ERG, other programs for diversity and so forth. And you can't open a paper every day without some mention of this, right? Or California requiring a certain number of African Americans, et cetera, on boards. Stepping away from your own company, what do you see as some examples of things that companies are doing to try to address this issue for Asian Americans and maybe also for, broader groups as well?
Yeah, from my side, I think it goes back to, I get the opportunity to network with a lot of different industries and executives. Harrison, I'm sure it does as well, just by nature of the role. But, we're constantly trying to see what experiments, what practices other companies are doing. One of the new things we're piloting is a talent council that looks at what are all the promotions going on in a company. We're actually kind of a middle-sized company, about 2,000 employees, so we could still kind of keep our arms around the number of employees, especially at the middle to senior leadership ranks, who's being hired and who's being promoted. And through that council, I think it could be a way to sort of steer directionally and have the right trajectory that we're trying to achieve for different facets of D&I. So that's just one idea that we kind of borrowed from another a supplier of the industry. There are others that we watch as well. For example, some of our customers publish their ERG reports. That's becoming more and more popular to become just put the data out there, good and bad. And obviously you hope that over time you make progress. So we're always trying to look at what are the other best practices out there and seeing what are the right ones for us where we are in our journey.
Yeah. I think on the McKinsey side, Peter, first of all, I'm actually very happy and proud that AAM, or Asians at McKinsey, is one of the 5 official diversity and inclusion affinity groups within our firm, along with our women's network, the McKinsey Black Network, Hispanic and Latino network, as well as gays and lesbian at McKinsey. Now, what this means is because we are quote unquote official, we have a seat at the table in any sort of diversity and inclusion topics. We have official funding from our firm, right? So that we can actually plan different programming and events that are most relevant for our community, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is to really understand what the needs of these communities are, right? We had talked about the number of entry levels hires at McKinsey for Asian versus not. What we've also found is that this challenge, this problem is not the same across the board. For example, my Black colleagues who are leaders in our MBN network, they have an overall attraction problem, even coming in at the more junior ranks. So are there certain recruiting events and initiatives that they can do to bring the right people into the firm and into the funnel, right? Whereas at least for Asian and McKinsey, we're much more focusing on advancement, particularly past the engagement management level. So I think just understanding a little bit of the challenge with each constituent group, you can actually devise certain initiatives that is most applicable to them.
Yeah.
The third thing is, we have seen that this challenge is not a similar, or is not a McKinsey only challenge. And that's why we have formed, many relationships and partnerships with other banks and technology firms and consulting firms to share best practices, to host, certain webinar events to compare notes and to form a network. Because beyond just the community, we've also hosted what we call the masterclass of Asian American executives, whom we also want to foster as they also form their own networks as well.
Yeah. Well, it's clearly a challenge, but I think part of your comment is it's not the same for every ethnic group. And even within Asian Americans, it's not the same for people from India or from Korea or from China, et cetera. So maybe people could comment though, because there clearly are some differences. And rather than saying, oh, complaining, saying, well, some seem to do better than others, it's also an opportunity to learn, right, from others where they might be more successful. I mean, one example is it's clear that Indian Americans are clearly doing better at this in terms of just statistically at the CEO level and the board level. The question is why, and what can you learn from that that's positive, as opposed to say, oh, well, they're doing better than we are. Any comments? I know, Harrison, you have some thoughts there.
No, that's absolutely correct. Within our Asians at McKinsey affinity group, we're inclusive for all Asians, whether it's South or Southeast, East, etc. We're all in this together. And to your point, there are certain topics that may resonate more versus others, right? Because what we found is this is also highlighted in our research. The Asian American community is not a monolith. Whether you look at income levels, education, etc., there's actually vast diversification amongst different sectors within the Asian American community. Actually, if you look at income, it has the highest delta between the highest and the lowest compared to any other ethnic group, right? So I don't, back to the earlier point David has mentioned, I don't think many people actually realize that fact. So I think part of it is education, but also understanding the nuances within the difference within the Asian American community to see what is most relevant for them.
Yeah, and I think there's one other issue that I want to point out that actually the three of us talked about, which is when we were just preparing, and that is Asian American in the United States are relatively inactive politically, and what they don't and for a lot of reasons, but unfortunately the whole thing is intertwined, right? Because if you don't have as much of a say or power in Washington, D.C. or state government, whatever, obviously it then has an impact on the private sector and nonprofits. And so that's one thing I think both of you said. We need, as a group, Asian Americans, we need to find ways to be more active. We need more Andrew Yangs of this world, right? Who are willing to be proactive and stick their neck out and try to make a difference. And now that's not a corporate thing, but obviously they're intertwined, right?
I totally agree. And I think that's why I applaud the Committee of 100 for being one of those few beacons out there that is kind of getting together this group of really, really impressive Asian American leaders and driving forward key issues in the way that either is platforms or just gaining more broad attention to the issues. So applaud the committee for their work in that area. And I know, Peter, you've been instrumental in moving many of those key initiatives.
Well, I've tried, and
Peter,
yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead, Harrison.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I add one more point
Sure.
based on what you said. I think having Asian Americans who are having the aspirations to run for the public office, I think makes a ton of sense, and we should definitely encourage that, right? But I think it is also important to realize that cannot be the only thing, and that is not the only thing. I think there's two other pillars to this that we need to consider. One is, as part of a democratic society, Asian Americans should just be part of the voting process. You should get out, you should register, you should vote for whichever party, right?
Right.
Asian Americans represent 6% of the overall population, 12% of the workforce. And in some states, it is actually the swing vote, if I would call it as such, right? Particularly in places like Nevada. So I don't think Asian Americans realize that the power they hold in the overall election and democratic process, number one. Number two is, beyond having people who are running for office at the end, many of them also require campaign contributions, fundings, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
So to your point about corporates or individuals, there is also an opportunity to play in that role to help, exert certain influences and discussion to our elected officials onto policies that are favorable and at least equitable to, the Asian American population, right? So I think having the public office is good, but in many cases, there's also a need to follow the money, so to speak.
Yeah. By the way, in our fourth Asian American Career Ceilings webcast, we had a Committee 100 member, Gary Locke, who is a great example of someone who not only at the state level as governor of the state of Washington, but also as an ambassador to China and also as a cabinet member, really shows the dedication, and for the right reasons. He was in government for the right reasons, not because he wanted power, but because he wanted to make good things happen. And we need more people like that. Although clearly he's not as good at crowd surfing as Andrew Yang, but which I guess is one of the new criteria for being successful as a candidate. My last question, and then since we have 26 questions lined up. I've
been trying to answer a few online, and I found, not surprisingly, my ability to type and think and talk at the same time is not good. So I'll pause.
So my last question is really, to what extent has the pandemic and all the things that have happened as a result of the pandemic have an impact or some nuance around this issue, right? And either near term or, more importantly, long term.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. From our side, two things I'd say, kind of more practically speaking. Obviously, many of us are working virtually. And so, this has become sort of the new or next normal during this pandemic. And it looks like we're going to be in some type of virtual environment for quite some time, or at least the foreseeable future. I'd say it puts even more emphasis on the need to reach out and be visible throughout an organization during this time, because you're not able to have those casual conversations or collaborate as you normally would. And so one is a very practical implication is you need to spend more time thinking about how visible are you in the organization, despite all the demands of your current role during the pandemic. The second is more of a strategic one, I'd say, for our company as well. We're looking at different ways of sourcing talent, because now we've proven that we can work virtually. And so while our headquarters is based in Chicago, when we're recruiting talent, we're casting a much broader net than we typically would for specific roles, because we said, okay, we've shown that we can work virtually. This team actually functions quite well virtually. So why not open up that talent pool, which then also opens up more opportunities to bring in candidates that improve our diversity, right? So I think there's opportunity with the pandemic. I think there's a famous saying in Chinese about that, crisis and opportunity. But obviously, I think on the practical side, thinking about how you stay visible, how you stay active and influential in your organization is number one.
Now, the first question I have here is from William Tung. Actually, a very good question, which is, diversity in corporate America seems to be the theme of our times, but that doesn't seem to necessarily include Asian American. It seems that it applies to all other ethnic groups. And that's kind of an interesting comment, you know, because think about the California new ruling, right? It doesn't say specifically Asian Americans, so forth. So it's a good question. Are the Asian Americans therefore essentially get left out in the cold with regard to this diversity movement? Either one of you can answer.
Yeah, I think it's really depends on the situation, right? Whether it's a particular state legislature or a particular corporation. But I think back to our earlier points, the reason why in some cases that Asian Americans are not in the conversation with some of these mandates is that people don't even see it or know it as an issue. So the first step, it is really about using a set of fact-based and data to highlight that it is an issue and use it to discuss it and to share, right? That I think is the first thing. The second thing is then sort of effect change and discuss in terms of what would be, you know, the right initiative or the right program for Asian Americans, right? Whether it's exactly the same as the Blacks or Latinos, I don't know. But I think having that level-set discussion, I think it's what's critically important to make sure that we're part of the discussion process.
Agree with Harrison. You know, acknowledging the issue with data, and then also having those right support groups to advocate and help the organization have that voice. So whether it's an affinity group or an ERG group, I think those are key tools that an organization can use. But having the data to acknowledge there's an issue, I think is really key in this one, to highlight that there are multifaceted challenges that are involved with diversity and inclusion.
You have a question here from Larry Chang. He says, I have observed that East Asian executives are reluctant to promote East Asian managers. True or not true? And if true, what can we do about it? By the way, it reminds me of, Harrison, something you said in the first webcast where you said, you've heard successful Chinese Americans say, I'll meet you at the top of the mountain if you ever get there, right?
Well, that was a notion on, you know, wanting to help each other, right?
Right,
Not necessarily on more senior, more junior, but yeah,
Right.
please go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, but it was, so is it true or not that East Asian executives are reluctant to promote East Asians? Yes or no? And if so, what can we do about it?
Yeah, I'm not sure. You know, I know in my history, when I became CEO, one of the first things I did was promote two of our really rising stars of both Asian to our executive team. They've since matriculated out and doing bigger things in other companies. And so I think for me, it's very much a focus, but having that talent pool to dig into is also important, right? You've got to have that next generation. Yeah. To me, I think the important thing is, are you investing in growing and developing those leaders so that you have not just one, you're not relying on one person in the organization to continue to get promoted, but you have a real leadership bench. And that's something that we're also focused on in our company. So, you know, I would say I haven't seen necessarily a bias against promotion, but I have seen, and I've been in different situations where there's just not a lot of choice. And that to me is a failure of leadership development and hiring and retention, all those things in a company.
First of all, Peter, David, I personally have not seen any facts or data around it. either, whether it's even interviews or surveys or whatnot. And I think the point that David raised is actually very important, because in order to promote somebody needs to be there for you to promote. If they're not already at the mid to senior level, would be typically somebody that David would want to promote, then that becomes a challenge, right? And if you have 1 out of 10, that's also a challenge, right? Now, of course, in many cases, my client executives are also running a business who have quarterly earning impacts and whatnot. And do they have the energy and the pathway to foster the next, 5 years, 10 years worth of pipeline of people, right? When you're trying to make, for example, the next quarterly numbers with the capital markets, that you're working with, right? So I think those are all considerations that need to be made. But that being said, right, at least anecdotally, personally, I have a client who is Asian American EVP at a Fortune 500 company. He recently came to me and basically said, hey, I'm looking for a VP of a particular role. And he did mention, I want it in particular who is Asian American, right? Because he, in fact, himself won, and they don't have enough in their organization. So they're actually tapping into the McKinsey network to see what we can provide for him.
Well, certainly one thing is true, and that is up until recently, when this terrible fight started out between, escalated between China and the US, so much growth is in Asia. And so particularly the international companies want people who have some knowledge and background about what's going on in Asia, because they're not necessarily just trying to tap into people who don't have a background, right? And so that's going to be helpful. There's a question here from a former panelist, Jennifer Lee. So Jennifer, welcome to this panel. You did a great job the other day. Here's a question actually to all three of us. Hi, Peter, Harrison, and David. Each of you has mentioned the importance of cultural fit, in which Asian Americans adapt their behaviors to fit a culturally specific model of corporate leadership. I'd like to get your insight about cultural flexibility, such that we privilege multiple models and styles of leadership that do not simply conform to a particular model of leadership. So really, any comments about this particular concept?
Yeah, I would just say from my experience, I've worked with the most impressive leaders I've worked with are actually those Asian leaders that are able to not only be effective in different cultures, for example, in China or Taiwan or South Korea, but then be equally as effective in a boardroom. And I don't know if I wouldn't consider it necessarily conforming. I think of it as just effective. And are you working on your executive presence? To me, it means that there's an acceptance of who you are by the organization, but you also can't be soft-spoken, right? You've got to make sure you're making your views known, expressing where you feel strongly, and overall just trying to improve your executive presence. I don't look at that as necessarily conformist. I think of that as the challenge that anyone would have to matriculate to an executive level or to a board level.
Yeah, and I think, Jennifer, first of all, thank you for the question, and good having you in this session, right? My sense to that question is that there's no sort of single model or single thread, right? You need to balance it. And in some ways, I actually personally feel that this goes beyond any cultural or ethnic potential barriers. Because at the end of the day, for me, when I engage with different individuals, is really trying as best as I can, understanding where they're coming from and being empathetic about it. How I discuss a particular topic with a CXO, which is one of my clients, will be different and approach than how I present a document to a board, right? So the former might be more open-ended, more counseling, asking open-ended questions to also trigger different thoughts in their minds. Whereas a board meeting might be, hey, I have these analysis, I have these data, let me show you the facts, and this is the reasons behind it, right? To situations where I've also had the fortunate opportunity to run large-scale frontline transformations, varied operations, service operations, and things like that. So in these situations, there could be frontline individuals who are of different education levels, are potentially immigrants with different language barriers, right? So how do you tailor a message for them to go through this change management and mindset shift that's really important for them to partake in this transformation program, right? So at the end of the day, I think it's really about tailoring your communication to the audience at hand to make sure that you can maximize the effectiveness.
I think another point is is maybe thinking about it in a different way, which is, look, all of you at some point had to make decisions about what school to go to, right? What college to go to, or so forth. And think back on those times where you made that decision. You looked at it in many ways, but including how do I fit with that school, right? And I think that is something that should continue throughout your life. And so one of the things to think about is there are so many different types of companies with different cultures and different biases and so forth out there, different personalities and so forth. And one of the things you should ask yourself when you're making a career decision is there a fit not only in terms of my skills, but in terms of their philosophies about people who look like me, right? And you don't have to be a pioneer and say, well, no one ever was promoted who was Asian American in this company, so I'm going to be the pioneer and I'm going to break through. You may want to do that, but I think part of it is sort of like the Indiana Jones film, which is choose wisely, right? Don't choose just based on some ranking or fancy gold cover or whatever. Choose where you think there's a very good fit with you. And one of the criteria should be, is my style and my ethnicity going to be an obstacle, neutral, or an advantage at this company, right? So that's just something to think about.
Really well said. Really well said. And I think it goes for not only organizations, but within an organization, what type of manager are you working for? Do he or she appreciate the cultural aspects and the advantages you're bringing? And is that appreciated, celebrated? I still think you need to also be contributing at that high level, working on your executive presence, but the environment really, really is important.
Yeah, that's right. The next one is, okay, there's some observations. Okay, here's one from someone who says, could you please share what are some good advice about how one can change stereotypes in situations that you are involved with, either because you are the target or because you observe something, that is not right. And this person gives an example, say my British boss always asks the Asian females on the team to take, meeting minutes. So how do you react if you're the Asian female? Or the other is, if you're in the room, how do you try to influence that behavior?
Yeah. Without knowing too much in that situation, it's hard to say, right? But that being said, I think one potential outcome is calling out certain microaggressions or unconscious bias, right? Again, I'm making the situation up. If there's 5 team members in the room and there's only one female and they always ask the one female, right? Another suggestion is, depending on who else is in this environment, there are other leaders that need to step up and say something. Because I know often it's very difficult for the more junior colleagues to be involved, right? But I think at the end of the day, when something is not right, somebody needs to say or do something. Otherwise, the situation will perpetuate.
Yeah, I agree with Harrison. I remember another example, similar perhaps to this example, where an executive at my company, no longer there, but set up a standing meeting on Friday night for Asia time. It was Friday morning US time. And they asked my opinion. At that time, I was head of Asia. I said, we're not going to attend that meeting, because if you attend the meeting, it's showing that that's okay to schedule a meeting every Friday night for our Asia leaders. And Obviously, we're talking about people in South Korea, Taiwan, et cetera. And it's just not okay to do that. And so we didn't attend the meeting. That sent a message to that executive, and they changed the schedule. I think you've got to call out when you see those things that are really, you feel strongly against. And there all might be an awareness situation there where the person or the organization is just not educated in that area, that they're not doing something that, or they're doing something that might be offensive or not encouraging. And so, there's training there. And then the other thing, keep going back to is, if there's advocacy groups, whether it's ERG or affinity groups, those are also great forums to bring up those situations where it is sometimes difficult, especially as a more junior member, to bring those up, to voice them out. My experience is actually voicing them out typically gets a good positive response, but every company and every environment is different.
Okay, so the last question, and then we'll end, because we like to end on time, is a little bit of a delicate question, but they basically say the recent movement of social movement with specific focus on Black lives, doesn't this suck up the oxygen in the rooms where people are advocating for Asians? In some reports, particularly technology, Asians are lumped along with whites, particularly male, since the percentages are higher in population. In the academic research, there's a term called underrepresented minorities, which was created specifically to exclude Asians. Any thoughts on this? Well, I will say one thing, which is certainly when you fill out a lot of forms, very often I end up other, right? Right? We go down, oh, I'm not Black, I'm not Latino, whatever, I'm other. So certainly in terms of all the kinds of government forms and things, I would say very significant ones, Asians are just clustered, not necessarily with whites, but in other. So I'm rooting for the other ethnic group. Any comments on this issue, David or Harrison?
Yeah, I would start off by saying first, let's acknowledge the Black Lives Matter movement is important. And it takes up a lot of attention. My focus has been, from our board to our management team, it's given us more opportunity to talk about diversity, inclusion, and belonging within the company, whether it's Asian American, Asian, gender, sexual orientation, or Black Lives Matter. And so having more opportunities to talk about it, as long as you're not just solely focused on BLM, which is important, I think is very, very healthy for an organization. I'll give you an example. My entire executive team took a 2-week training course just on, biases that they may have towards hiring. And we're trying to revitalize our hiring efforts, not just towards Black Lives Matter, but I would say that this has become top of list and more of a priority for us because of some of the movements happening in the US. So I think of it as, yeah, it does take a lot of attention, but it's a great opportunity to talk about diversity, inclusion, belonging in general, because that topic is top of mind, and employees want to hear our views as management about it. And so we've leveraged it as an opportunity. Every company is different, but it's been much more of an opportunity for us than sort of a minimization of what we're doing.
Yeah, and I'll come on another comment, which is a lot of the work we've done, committees, shows that there's been very explicit efforts on the part of the African American community, the Jewish community, so forth, to help Asian Americans and Chinese Americans. And I don't think people recognize how much, and that's separate from the fact that they paved the way in terms of civil rights. That's an indirect, but there's unbelievable amount of evidence showing that a lot of direct help has been given to the Asian American and Chinese American community by other ethnic groups. Harrison, you want to have the last word?
No, I think we're all aligned, right? I think that Black Lives Matter is a very important movement. We're in a very critical and important time in our country, right? So I think it is really about building allyship across the board. That being said, I do think tactically, in terms of having the granularity of data and having the right checkboxes, et cetera, it needs to happen. But that to me is much more of a tactical, almost administrative type process.
Yeah. So with that, I want to thank, first of all, our two panelists who I hope you agree done an excellent job of sharing their stories and perspectives, but also answering your questions. I also want to thank the audience. We have a big audience here, and you provided some very, very good questions. And I'm just sorry that we couldn't answer all of them. With that, what I'd like to do is just tell you that this is being recorded, so it'll be available. We'll send you all the people who registered the links so that you can, it's sort of like Netflix, so you can watch it over and over again, right? The other is that when I end this session, I'm going to immediately open up the other session so that people can really just, obviously voluntarily decide to join that session and get to know each other. So I hope you'll take advantage of that. And the good news is there won't be any speeches, right? So thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. And again, I want to thank David and Harrison for really doing an excellent job.
Thanks, Peter. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you for having us, Peter.